Right now I'm feeling like making objects and works doesn't feel sufficient.
Sufficient to what?
Like I think sufficient for like how much research I like to do, how much I want to be engaged with by a public or by like whatever the audience is, however small or large, in terms of like critique, I guess.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. If you had to pick two conversations that defined the last 10 years in art, one would certainly be about digital culture and online life. The other would be about race, racism, and representation. The critic and artist Aria Dean has been at the center of both these conversations. As a theorist, Dean's essays on these topics are much cited. You can find them gathered in the recent collection Bad Infinity from Sternberg Press. She also worked for some years at rhizome.org, one of the most important venues advocating for digital art. As an artist, Dean has been in many important shows, from the Hammer Museum's Made in LA Biennial to the Whitney Biennial here in New York. Recently, for the Performa Biennial of Performance Art, Dean staged The Color Scheme, a two-person theatrical work which is also set to tour to Berlin later this year. The Color Scheme focuses on an imagined meeting in the 1920s in Berlin between two Black intellectuals, one called the poet and the other called the philosopher. It may be as close as Dean has come to totally fusing her work as a thinker with her work as an art maker. It literally stages a conversation about Black culture, politics, and art. Yet the Color Scheme also plunges us a century back in time, very much away from the world of digital culture she has written so much about. It felt to me like a continuation of the important debates Dean has been a part of, but also an attempt to find new perspective. And it seemed like a good cue to talk to her about how she's viewing art now, why she's looking to art history, and how her views have evolved over a tumultuous decade. Aria Dean, thanks for joining me on The Art Angle.
Thank you for having me.
Where are you calling in from today?
I am in Princeton, New Jersey.
Well, I want to talk to you about your career and your thinking and this new work of art that I saw. But let's just start with a little about you. Tell me about your journey as an artist and as a thinker. What drew you into art?
So I went to Oberlin College, started in 2011, graduated 2015. And I guess I got into art like in a proper sense there. I was like a kid who had drawn and painted and written a lot throughout my life. But then I think my entry point to like really starting to, give a shit was like Oberlin has a long history with like, conceptual art movements in, the 20th century because they have the Allen Art Museum and did a lot of exhibitions, were early collectors of that work. And so we had this like really heavy emphasis on conceptual art in all of our studio classes. And so I guess like I encountered people like Saul Lewitt and then like later people like Robert Smithson and then my all-time favorite Robert Morris, and got really obsessed with these artists who had a command of language, sort of quote unquote dematerialized and at times relationship to art practice more expanded, and whose work really was sort of like, to me, appeared to be like a series of philosophical postulates that often involved material. So that was like when I fell in love with art, I guess, was when it seemed to look like philosophy.
Yeah. High conceptualism.
Right. Yeah. And then also I wanted to be an architect when I started college. And so I was like doing a lot of architectural theory. Oberlin doesn't have like an architecture program at all, but I was interested in that. And so I think the architecture stuff led me to like media theory, which led me to the world of like net art. And so then that was like soon after I got into that stuff. And that became like the world that I like sort of, I guess, various periods of conceptual art.
So you're interested in this classic conceptualism, and then you graduate into what art historically we think of as the post-internet moment. And were you organically seeing connections between those two periods? Conceptualism was exploring new media's impact on visual art, and then some of that translated naturally over into that moment of digital culture.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw some connections, hindsight's 2020, but I had a professor, someone, Julia Christensen, who's wonderful, and she taught media art focused classes at Oberlin. So the way that she taught that stuff was through this lens of like, it's related to or an extension of conceptual art and also like experimental film practices, like, early works like Olia Leolina, My Boyfriend Came Back from the War, which has this like montage theory. So like
a net artwork of some note from that, maybe a little before, maybe the 90s or even.
Yeah, or like early 90s center. But so I guess it's to say that that was happening. And then also Oberlin has this curious history of net art and post-internet relations as well, because Corey Archangel went to Oberlin, and as did Lauren Cornell and Jacob Chiacci. So there was like this built-in legacy there that Julia, my professor, was very keen to explore with us. I think Corey was maybe one of the first like net artists who I heard about through the Oberlin portal. But to answer your question more specifically, I think like I don't know if I was drawing those connections. I just knew I liked all of that stuff, I guess. And then whatever connections were drawn by the artists I was reading, or I was looking at, I think early on, I don't even know how, but I like stumbled across Seth Price Dispersion, which is still a little bit earlier, of course, but that was like mind blowing text to me, remains seminal.
It's come up a bunch on this podcast. A lot of people looking at that text, which is about how images spread in new ways and have multiple lives. And it just is interesting because that was a concern of conceptualism, was like how the image and the representation of the image became a whole new aesthetic of its own. And then that replicated itself in that post-internet period in ways that were both conscious and unconscious, I feel like. Almost like sometimes people looking back to like rules-based art like Silhouette and then thinking about that in terms of code. And then sometimes the echoes were just very unconscious.
And as well, I think then like groups like thinking about more like the high post-internet period. The jogging was a huge touchstone for me, which was Brad Trammell, Josh Citarella, who else was involved?
Which was a Tumblr blog, an art Tumblr blog.
One of my best friends growing up was when Christine Jackson, she went to UCLA for college, and she ended up kind of in that scene in LA. And so I was getting a lot of stuff from her and her friends from just talking throughout the semester. So I was like stuck in Oberlin, but then was like getting all this like LA post-internet stuff. And then through all these things, like through the formal education, and then that started reading Rhizome and was kind of got into that world. When you look back, the jogging in particular, I think is an interesting example. I mean, it's so not discussed now as a project, but I mean, the writing that Brad and Lauren were doing and that everyone was doing about like the way that images circulated was like an obvious precursor, I think, to me. Like that was how I got interested in the circulation of images online. I understood that I could take the things I was learning from my explorations of like 20th century conceptualism, as well as from architectural theory. And then I was doing also a lot of philosophy. I would do like an intensive, like independent research project on phenomenology and the ethics and aesthetics of like built environments. So I was like really invested in Heidegger. And I think all these things came together. Or also just like this through naivete. Like I just saw like that's all of this in some sort of continuum, because I was just like, oh yeah, well, I'm interested in all these things. So they must be like kind of historically related to one another. In that period, I feel like that was just the stuff that we were like eating up. And then my friend Casey Silverstein and I started a project space at Oberlin. We started bringing a lot of people from the post-internet scene to campus.
While you were in college?
Yeah, we had this project space called Storage. Before that, another friend and I started this thing called like Don't Unplug Me that was about like women and experimental media. And we brought Martine Sims, who I knew through the Ooga Booga orbit in LA. I interned at Ooga Booga, the Monday House bookstore. We were both from the Pasadena area, so had that connection. And then we brought Andrew Norman Wilson, we brought Amalia Ullman, Devin Kenny, some Bruce High Quality people.
The people who were big in that time period, in the early 2010s, exploring ideas of image circulation and how it intersected with the gallery, the space, essentially.
In that period, everyone was talking about how you didn't have to live in New York or LA or Berlin. So we were like, well, then we will, from Oberlin, Ohio, create this node in the network and try to become an inflection point or somewhere people were meeting.
Did you find that not to be true ultimately, that you did need to be in New York?
I think it probably was true for people a little bit older than me. Like it might have been the case that between 2010 and 2015, it did feel that way and that people's practices were able to circulate. I graduated into a version of the art world and the internet that was becoming a little more centralized. The advent of like the feed logic, and that like it wasn't so much about pockets, like Tumblr logic, which was more like people gathering in these like, different blog, like sort of blog culture, the sort of end of that. I feel like I graduated into like the Instagram feed and like Twitter, and it felt kind of like things were happening in these major centers. I mean, I remember like people were moving to Chicago after graduation because Chicago felt like the place that was in the US, like where if you were like 22, like Queer Thoughts, the gallery was still there, like also was happening. I mean, part of it was I like needed a job and I was from LA and I wanted to like live at home. And so I did that. And I feel like in the following 5 years, it felt like things were happening. You weren't hearing about like a project space in like whatever little city anymore as much.
It's interesting. Now, I've never thought about this way before, but I guess in some cases, what we call the post-internet art world, which is again the early 2010s, I've never thought about it that way. That it's actually also the pre-social media art world. It might have been sort of like a moment of digital culture production before social media made like the persona and the performance of your life essential, and that changed things again.
Yeah. It's like that period when, in any, again, then you think about like art and technology, the history of art as a history of like techniques or whatever, and like how people engage with the technology. It's like early video art or something. And when people were like, oh, huh, okay, this is new. Like, let's play with it, and how it disseminates information and images. And I think that the tail end of post internet stuff was more like that. Like, if you think like Amalia doing the Excellence and Perfections project,
which is an Instagram-based performance where she staged herself moving to New York, or a character moving to New York as an Instagram character.
right? That project, I think, was such, I don't want to say novel because that sort of, I think, trivializes it, but there were net art projects that did something like that before, but the sort of realism, I guess, and also like the sort of situatedness of it and the straight faced deadpan felt completely new. And I think it was also because the platform didn't have conventions yet, where there wasn't an Instagram orthodoxy of like how people posted. It was just kind of like, this is life.
I think it might have happened before the term influencer was even a thing.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I've seen at least, and this is me being like all like like annoyed that, but I feel like I've seen 3 or 4 projects in the years since then that have done something similar without any historical knowledge of the original Molly Ullman project. But it's interesting seeing people try that over and over.
Yeah.
It's just a different thing each time. And it's not more interesting. It seems more naive because it's like the structure of Instagram in that regard. It's not an interesting inquiry or something in the same way.
Well, I know you were flirting with writing a book on post-internet art. I mean, do you think it's because there's not a history of that moment that things repeat like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's like an oral history within a certain scene. Like, I feel lucky and sort of am in an interesting position because I think I'm like, myself and a few friends of mine are probably the younger edge of the people who were active in that period. I've been like disparagingly called a post-internet artist by people online, and I'm like, that's funny because I wasn't really there. I was like a kid looking at it and I was obsessed with that work, and I became friends with a lot of those people then through my job at Rhizome after I'd graduated, but I was really young. But I think that it lives in this scene of people that are all connected through that period. And a lot of those people are in the film world. A lot of those people are now podcasters. A lot of those people are like writing novels or doing theater. Like, they're all over the place, but there isn't a centralized attempt to write it down. I mean, the Net Art Anthology project that Michael Connor and I did at Rhizome, which was modeled after the Anthology Archive, 100 films list. We did like 100 works of net art and a sort of a canon, non-canon thing that could continue to expand. There is like some post-internet stuff in that in the later sections, but it was also really hard to get people to want to talk about it because the post-internet, even the term, was so contested and like so unappealing to people. And then also socially and emotionally, interpersonally, it was all very complicated. So what could have been a history kind of didn't happen in that portion of that project because it seemed like no one wanted it, which was interesting.
Well, maybe when the wave of early 2010s nostalgia hits in in 10 years, that'll kick in. I was reading you talking about the latest work for Performa, which is a theatrical work that's a dialogue, and you said something to the effect of you're interested in people who can't help but talk about ideas. I think people can probably hear already that you're very much like that. You're very much someone who goes between thinking and making. So how did you become a maker, and how do you think about making? You also seem to move between a lot of positions, like some of those artists from the conceptual art generation in the 60s that you admired, like Robert Morris and Saul LeWitt and so on.
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm going to be speaking from Princeton, New Jersey, where I'm in my second semester of a PhD program. So I think like that probably says something about how I'm relating to it at the moment. For a long time, I felt like they were not distinct. In writing, I was always more interested in writing about the outside world and not about my own practice, and writing about things that just got stuck on, just like things that irritated me enough to like irritated, like in a negative sense or in a positive sense, just like an irritant that I needed to explore. But I also think that looking back, I thought that was very separate from the making in some ways. But also, like, these two things were like churning material. Like, I would write, and then if I couldn't write something, I would make something. When language failed me, that was when I felt most compelled to make stuff, especially in a sculptural sense. But I think as I started to move towards more film and performance stuff that has more narrative and more language in the work itself, I feel like it relieved some of that. Whatever I couldn't say, I was starting to say it in different ways. I was putting it into dialogue, and it was, giving characters like these things to work through. So it sort of shifted what I was using writing for. But I think then I started just feeling also, I think right now I'm feeling like making objects and works doesn't feel sufficient.
Sufficient to what?
Like, I think sufficient for like how much research I like to do, how much I want to be engaged with by a public or by like whatever the audience is, however small or large, in terms of like critique, I guess. Like, I feel like writing as an artist, I've found that it feels like people are like, I guess in a way, like provincialize what you're saying. And it's not taken as like, I've made a theoretical argument. Here's what I'm saying. It's kind of always feels like it's been tinged with this like, oh, you felt that way, or like that describes what you were making. And I don't think that's always the case with how my writing has been treated. I know that people have experienced those things as like useful in a variety of ways. But in terms of like even like giving a paper or a presentation, I started to feel like I wasn't getting the feedback that I wanted, and I wasn't growing necessarily also through that kind of engagement. But I think that was just a me thing. Like, it was like I wasn't really that interested in like just publishing into like this sort of shrinking sphere of like online art publishing or whatever, and like having people read it or whatever. And I think the way that value is produced through publishing right now is frustrating to me in terms of like what criticism does. I'm sure you have also feelings on how things have shifted over the years, but
I have feelings in my bones, Arya.
yeah.
I feel it in my body. How things have shifted, how attention has
Yeah.
shifted. I mean, there's something like you showed a piece in the Whitney Biennial, this Little Island Gut Punch from 2022, which was it kind of like a post-minimal work of art. Like it looks like an obelisk, a green obelisk, kind of like a green screen. And it's the product of you warping something or simulating collision inside digital simulation.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of functions as illustration of a thought you had or an experiment you were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like at the time, I feel like I would have been like, no, absolutely not. It's its own separate thing. And I'm just like compelled to make stuff. And going back to this sort of like poor reading of conceptualism when I was like 19 years old, where I was like, oh, these guys are just doing like philosophy. But I mean, in a way it is, but it also like that's kind of not enough it doesn't fully describe it. But I think in some ways that is often what I end up doing in making works. It's like I'm thinking about how an object functions. I mean, for a long time, it was like I was thinking about how blackness functioned in the world. And I think like writing pieces like Poor Meme, Rich Meme, for instance, or Notes on Black Acceleration, these were like these attempts to theorize the structural qualities of blackness and using object lessons that, sort of could inflect back on that. And then I think with making objects for a long time, I was like, okay, so like I'm applying these structural qualities or these structures to making a thing. So the thing is going to do the same thing, and like what happens if an object does those things in real space, which I thought that was bad or something because it seemed like not creative. I mean, I guess there's a romantic idea that artists are like feeling things or expressing things, but I was pretty like I'm testing, like I'm doing tests. Like seeing I think with sculpture, that's how I relate to it, because it's like a sculpture is an opportunity to explore a kind of presence, or how something operates or how things operate together in space. Film and video, different.
I do want to talk to you about your essays, like Rich Meme, Poor Meme, and Notes on Black Acceleration, which are in Bad Infinity, your collection of essays, partly because I think they'll tee us up to talk about, your new play, which is in some ways about representation. But these were essays from the 2010s that were very much you thinking about the stakes of how images of blackness, black suffering, and black culture in general circulated on the internet and were affected by digital culture. And I feel like that was a very important conversation. Obviously, that was the era of Black Lives Matter, which, emerged out of a hashtag. What was the argument in your head that overall you were trying to get at or make through those kinds of essays?
Yeah. So that was 2016. And then Notes on Black Acceleration was like the following year, I guess. And I had been working on them like pretty much like boom, boom, like in succession. But it was like, yeah, sort of peak Black Lives Matter, beginning of like Trump 1.0, or is about to be that period. The argument I was trying to make, I think, was always, again, like a structural one. I noticed that it seemed like in my readings about Blackness or an experience of it and cultural objects, et cetera, and lived experience. And then as well in my like understanding of like images online through my interest in media theory, like it just seemed like there was structurally something similar between memes and Blackness. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then also the fact that like Black people were like excelling, I guess, like the Vine era, et cetera, excelling at producing online content at the very same time as like police brutality videos were the other major thing we were seeing everywhere. The thing that I thought was most salient to me still, and I think that I really was trying to figure out was like, okay, like this meme stuff seems like Blackness isn't always just attached to Black people, right? It's like some sort of like force. Maybe it's an affect, maybe it's a structure. But like, do memes operate in a similar way? If they do, then what are these logics? And it's not so much about the imagery, but about how the thing moves and like what it does as it goes. And so I was trying to articulate that. I have reread it recently, so when I had to write something about it, so I've been thinking about it. It's hard to like remember what at 23 I thought I was doing.
10 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's a decade ago, which makes me feel crazy. Like I think that I wanted to make some sort of like economic or political economic argument or something. But I think the Notes on Black Acceleration is when I kind of got more into that. And also as I was writing, I was like learning as I was going also. So I was like reading a lot of stuff and kind of like vomiting out these like, okay, so then it's this and then it's that. And with Notes on Black Acceleration, I think that was then I was like, okay, so I'd been steeped in this accelerationist discourse, I think in terms of also early things that got me interested in art. So accelerationism, as I understand it, I think the definition has probably shifted for many people over time and sort of political shifts. But the original idea, sort of like that the only way out of capitalism is the sort of cheeky, one-liner version of it. People who were like associated with this were the late Mark Fisher, British theorist. It's all sort of started in Britain, and some Americans who engage with it and other nodes around the world. The reviled Nick Land was, but then that was before he completely shifted over to sort of far right lunacy.
Became a fascist, yeah.
Became a fascist. Kojo Eshun, who written beautifully, who I think also he was hugely influential for the poor me rich team stuff as well, because the way he's written about Blackness and technology. But all these people were involved with like the CCRU.
It's Institute for Cybernetic Studies in the UK.
But just, I guess, to sort of like preamble, I guess, about that piece, like my introduction to that stuff was like, I don't even remember how, but I like stumbled across like capitalist realism and read it my sophomore year of college. And I hadn't really read any of the stuff that came before, like all the sort of like Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. So that was my like inroad into then a longer history of critical theory and Marxist writing. And so I worked my way backwards from that, which I always think is sort of, I don't know if it's unfortunate or fortunate, but it's a weird way to start. Like, I feel like that will always like tinge my reading of a lot of things, for better or for worse. And I also read a lot of Mencius Moldbug's writings and Nick Land. So I did the whole like crazy dark enlightenment. But all to say that with Notes on Black Acceleration, I was trying to then, because I was so interested in accelerationism, I was going back through like earlier blog posts by Alex Williams, who's one of the authors of Inventing the Future, which I think is a great book. And I think people should go back and read it. But arguments between Williams and Mark Fisher about the sort of accelerationist subject as a concept. And by that, they meant like a subject that could assist capital towards this inevitable demise, but come out the other side of the black hole. And the way they were describing this accelerationist subject had a lot to do with intimacies with the commodity structure and a sort of like curious affinity there. And I was like, oh, this just reminds me of stuff I was reading in Black studies about racial capitalism, slavery, the sort of way that Black people were converted into commodities through the slave trade and circulated as such. So then, that came out of like an attempt to join those two things. Afro-pessimism was the other thing in the pot there, like most associated with Frank Wilderson, which is a analytic, not a movement, I suppose they say, that posits that the sort of structural antagonism of the Western world is between white and Black people. It's about the Black being not just subhuman, quote unquote, or dehumanized, but being actually fundamentally not human. And there's a lot of other, the best piece to read by Wilderson, if anyone's interested, and that is Gramsci's Black Marks, which kind of outlays some of those ideas. But basically, this idea that there's something like fundamental at an ontological level about Black people and Blackness that draws a line between us and civil society, or us and the human. And so I was trying to work with that, I suppose. Looking back, I guess I was trying to find a way to have my cake and eat it too, in terms of like the history of Marxism I was interested in, and the sort of prevailing ideas at that moment in that circle, and also in this Black Lives Matter movement, that the fundamental thing we have to deal with politically in America, possibly in all the West, is this legacy of slavery and the status of the quote unquote, the status of the Black as this fundamentally antagonistic presence within civil society. And that felt like the way to deal with it, because I tried to flip that and make it like that the Black subject could be the accelerationist subject because of those things.
I went back and read Rich Meme, Poor Meme, which I had quoted in something I had written about cultural appropriation for my last book. And I was struck in it by how it's interesting. A lot of the way art processed that moment was a demand for representation. And I feel like what you see as a theorist of digital culture and of memes, what you were already saying was trying to move beyond that conversation in these essays, where you say in Rich Meme, Poor Meme, the 20th century taught us that one of our rights is a right to representation, not only politically, but personally, that we have a right to be represented as we are, for our images to hold true. But what if one says to hell with that? Blackness as poor image as meme is a copy without original. And so it is almost like some of those frustrations and impasses. I mean, this is an obsession now of the limits of identity politics and the kind of garbled way art has handled this. It just, they're already there. You know, whatever limitations you see in those essays now, I feel like you were already thinking around the problems of representation even in the moment when that conversation was circulating.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, I forgot that I wrote those lines. I remember that being what I was interested in, but I remember also it felt really hard to articulate. Yeah, because of what the structure of the conversations were in the field at the time. And I think I was like also searching for the language and the frameworks, I think, to articulate all of it. And I feel like I had a little toolbox and I was working with what I had.
So let me ask you then about your commission for Performa, which is going on to Berlin, right?
Yes.
And it's a play called The Color Scheme, or I don't even know if I'd call it exactly a play. What is it? I mean, tell me about how this thing came to be and how it relates to some of these earlier thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we've jokingly called it a play that's a movie, that's a play, that's a movie, that's a play, that's a movie. Like kind of, it can go infinitely. Structurally, what it is that it is a play that takes place on a classic sort of proscenium style, like raised stage. It's a play for two actors, but then there are also two cameras set up that are capturing the entire thing. There's a live switchboard. The cameras are being fed to that and then cut into a montage that's then being projected on a screen behind the actors. And on the other two screens, there are three screens. And on the two screens on the sides are virtual backdrops that the actors are being shot in front of. And then that center screen projects the sort of quote unquote finished film image. So you're basically able to watch either or, both, and a play, two actors on a stage circulating in sort of the non-space of theater, or you can watch also this film where it's like, mostly two shots and close-ups of them in this sort of walk and talk. And subject matter wise, what's happening on stage or in the mise en scene of the project is that there are these two men, the poet and the philosopher. The year is 1923, and they've met up in Berlin's Tiergarten to go for a walk. Neither of them is really sure what the purpose of their meeting is, but they've been in touch via letters, or kind of from the same scene of artists and intellectuals back in the States. And they're both Black, and they are having like a link up, I guess is what we call this now. Like,
it's
let's
like
link.
A romantic slash philosophical
Yeah.
conversation about politics.
Yeah. It's like a romantic comedy in one scene. It's both the first meeting in a romantic comedy, like classically formulated on film, but it's also the whole thing kind of playing out in some ways, or sort of this like stretched out rom-com moment. But they're talking about philosophy, they're talking about politics, they're talking about their work lives, the economics of their positions, etc.
So, as you said, formally it has this doubled structure where it's a live performance, but then it's also being processed as an image, montage as an image. It's almost, in some senses, at least as I was watching it, almost as if the image is the real thing and the people on the stage are kind of really seeing the artifice of how they're performing for the cameras. But nevertheless, it's set in 1923. It's two Black intellectuals and artists in 1923, and you're been such a theorist of digital culture. Like I was just saying, you were thinking through things digital culture could offer to the conversation about Blackness and Black politics in the 2010s and 2020s. Why go back into the past? Why go into this particular time period of cultural debates around Black politics?
I came up with the idea for it during COVID. It was like, idea initially was like for a video work and then turned into this play. But I think around 2020, sort of as the bookend, I guess, of the Black Lives Matter period or something, like the George Floyd stuff, I kind of was feeling, and as I have complicated feelings about a lot of stuff I wrote before that, because I was feeling like I just don't think that this stuff necessarily holds water, like the sort of ideas around Blackness that are being circulated and accepted in the art world, the sort of melancholic
pop Afro-pessimism.
Yeah, exactly. Like pop Afro-pessimism, exactly. Black melancholia or melancholia around Blackness that's beyond just Black people at this point. Everyone's like, oh, boo. And like the afterlife of slavery which is an amazing phrase, and when properly used academically, those ideas are, or properly used in general, great. But pop Afro-pessimism had kind of taken over. All to say that I was really interested in, like, okay, like this stuff is really, it has such a hold on me, it has such a hold on discourse. Like, where does it come from? And so I was kind of working my way backwards historiographically and intellectual history wise, like, okay, well, so then the 90s and then the 80s. And I was like kind of mapping it. And then I read this book by Aria Dean, Thinking in Disorder, which is great. It's really big. I didn't finish reading the book, but it's great. There's a section on...
You didn't have to admit that, Arya.
I felt like I had to. But there's a section on Du Bois in it, and Du Bois, he had a love for Wagner, which is really interesting, but also his time in Berlin. And then there was a footnote in that about Locke's time in Berlin. Alain Locke, father of the Harlem Renaissance. So then I was like, well, that's interesting, this like Berlin connection. And I think at the same time I was working for Arthur Davis Film Company, and we had this conversation with Greg Tate before he passed about a movie idea he had about this Black guy living in Berlin. There's all this stuff about like Black people in Berlin coming up. And I was like, that's interesting. That's not like the main focus here, but whatever. Long story short, then I found this thing about this conversation between Alain Locke and Claude McKay in this article. And like, it was a footnote. And then I went to the article and I was like, this is so interesting, this conversation that there are no details about, but they're like having this disagreement. And part of the problem that I was interested in this pop Afro-pessimist moment and looking at it in the longer history of the 20th century and into the 19th century was just like how streamlined the story of like what Black politics and aesthetics have been throughout the 20th century. Like Harlem Renaissance was not a monolith. There wasn't a coherence or like a total agreement on what should be happening. There were Black liberals, Black communists, Black conservatives. There was like a whole life world of stuff going on. So
Claude McKay, was the basis of one of your characters, Black Marxist, went to Moscow.
Exactly. Yeah. And I just was really interested in going back to that sort of almost like, not as like total origin point, but what feels like an origin point. And then also, and now I have language for this with the Afro-pessimism thing, I think I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater with it, but I think it's a really useful analytic for looking at the 20th century, possibly. Like you can look at, in terms of like Du Bois' idea that like the 20th century's problem is a problem of the color line. That then I think makes Afro-pessimism as a lens, like as a historical tool for historicizing the 20th century becomes really potent, but it doesn't continue to work in the 21st century, especially after George Floyd, during genocide in Gaza, now with the ICE stuff. It doesn't make sense in terms of what the antagonisms are that structure the West or the global North. So I thought that in a way, it felt like, oh, this is the right time period to work through these questions in.
So I think the play does something worth commenting on around the theme of representation, because you've been thinking about that problem, and then it's based on a real unknown historical conversation, but a real conversation that people think happened between these two important intellectuals in the 1920s in Berlin. But then those characters aren't them, too. They're just called the poet and the philosopher, and it's specifically sort of removed from a specific representation. And I know that in your head, this all relates back about how you think Black subjectivity, Black characters are usually represented in culture. It's a very specific decision, correct?
Yeah, it's twofold. I was always been interested in film and performance, and I, for years, had this great anxiety about like, how do I, with all of these theoretical ideas swirling around in the work that I do, and also culture in the US being what it is in terms of how people receive representations of Black people, and which is to me, in short, like either it's not even so much about like stereotypes, but it's like, okay, like being made to mean something greater. It's really hard to have like an imminent and individualized Black character in a film or movie or TV show. That's been proven. So I could like try to write something where like, it's just like mumblecore and nothing matters and everyone's just having little conversations, which like I've tried and I've done. And I'm interested in that. But I also was like, I'm so interested in movies and theater and novels that have politics in them, have philosophy in them. I also am really dedicated to the idea that you don't have to make films and theater and stuff that doesn't have those things because, people don't like watching stuff where people talk about philosophy. Like a lot of people don't, but some people do. I like that. So whatever. I was just like, I'm going to try this thing where like these people have to be completely just individuals, but they're individuals that are an assemblage of qualities of famous people, people I know, myself, but they're going to be packed in, consolidated, and have to become totally imminent to themselves. And so like they're not about like, okay, it's Lane Locke. Like, ooh, can you pick out the like line from the article that he wrote? But it's also not about making up totally imaginary people. It's not auto-fictional either. A lot of this was rooted in this Deleuze essay about conceptual personae and like the critic dialogue and sort of like this idea like how to have people deliver concepts sort of represent them, but it's para-representational. They're not representing the concepts through their actions necessarily, but like it is like this discursive puppet show almost.
There's an erotic subtext to them too. It's
Yes.
sort of interesting. It's intellectual, very heady conversation, very political conversation. It's in a way like
Yeah.
a Socratic dialogue in that
Hmm.
there's a lot of erotic subtext in those
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. And I think that also was interesting to me because I think I'm not a scholar of queer Berlin or the queer Harlem Renaissance, but I've read a fair amount about those things. And, Lane Locke famously was a gay man, was not out. And that really figured prominently into like his work and his life and difficulties he had. Jeffrey Stewart's biography of him is fantastic. I read that for this project and was lucky enough to have a conversation with him for Ursula, the How's Your Mirth magazine. But we talked a lot about like this meeting being this like sexy hang. This also was like famously a cruising spot as well, still to your garden still is. And so like this also like this sort of thing where it's like these people are meeting to like talk about their writing, but they're really there to see like, are we gonna like hook up? And I think that's like a really like frisson of that kind of interaction is really compelling to me when things are indeterminate in that way. I was interested as well in this idea that like these are two people who on paper don't seem that dissimilar, right? On paper, even historically on paper, in the archive, like people are like, oh yeah, like probably, you might read something, people are like, oh yes, like they were part of the same movement, Harlem Renaissance. But it's like, again, not only do they have divergent political views, like Elaine Locke is like liberal is generous, he's quite conservative, in many ways. And then Kay had just come back from, the W Union, like also they just again like kind of hate each other. There's this love-hate thing, at least the way that I've
Mm.
written them, where it's like they understand that they're looking in the mirror in some ways, but this is a misrecognition. And it's like, oh, why can't I be compatriots with you? And it's for all these reasons, but God, I wish I could, because isn't that the political project theoretically at the time that they should be compatriots? And I think for me, it also is about like having a politic beyond a race consciousness, I suppose, and in a way beyond just even pure class conscious, but like an actual political horizon being necessary. But if I expanded it, it'd be a bit of an allegory in some ways for this like period in the art world from like 2015 to 2021 or something, where it's like identity politics stuff that was supposed to dictate people's affiliations and outlooks that really amounted to very little, and it masked a sort of like lack of a real politic in a lot of people's work and lives.
I saw it here in New York where it's going to mean one thing. You're taking it to Berlin where it's going to mean another. Are you nervous about that?
I am. I'm excited and nervous. And if any Germans are listening, please be gentle. No, but I'm really excited. We haven't totally locked in our location, so I don't want to be like, oh, like it's this, but I think it'll be really interesting to do it in Berlin. I think also like the way that we produced it working closely with Flip Caustic on the visuals. I went and found all these monuments that were still in Berlin in this Citadel Spandau that were like destroyed in the war. And I didn't know the extent of the destruction. They were in such a weird state. And I made all these scans of them and sent to Flip. And then he meticulously touched them up. But we decided not to reconstruct them and to fix them. We like left them as they were. Had a lot to do with readings and rereadings of Walter Benjamin and like trying to figure out something with like, is this a historical materialist approach, etc. It was a really intense experience. And I think that doing it in Berlin will be compelling for all of us. And I think kind of scary because it is a totally different context. And I just hope that people get that it's about two people who don't really know what they're talking about, but kind of do. Like, it's not really working out the problem. It's still is narrative.
Well, Arya, you make me feel like a person who kind of knows what they're talking about, but not really. Very good to talk to you about all your work, and I look forward to seeing where it goes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.